If what you knew wasn't true, when would you want to find out?
Enjoy the episode.
If you're an investor or want to be an investor and you're looking to create passive income that exceeds your monthly expenses, then this is the podcast for you. Here on the Infinite Wealth Podcast, we combine the philosophies of Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad, along with Nelson Nash's infinite banking concept. Welcome to the Infinite Wealth Podcast. I'm Cameron Christensen, along with our co-host Anthony Faso. And today we're excited because we are getting back to the basics. We're diving back into Nelson Nash's Becoming Your Own Banker book. Anthony, how excited are you?
I would tell you, I am excited. And we were, when we were talking about going back to this, we did go through the book when we first started.
We did.
I did look, that was over 4 years ago, almost 5.
I know, that's wild. Episode 6.
Yeah.
Episode 6. First 5 was you introducing yourself to everybody.
Yeah. And you just being there nervous, right?
But we didn't have a camera then.
We didn't have a
so
camera.
They couldn't see it. They didn't know
I know
that.
they didn't see it. They didn't see how good your hair even looked back then.
Yeah.
I remember we had one mic,
Yep.
which made it a little awkward.
Sitting around the desk and there's a copier machine outside the door. Remember that? Sometimes during episodes, you'd hear somebody come in and
Yeah. And we noticed that some of those episodes, even though they were so old, were some of our top downloaded episodes. And honestly, I feel a little bit like the sound quality. Just wasn't it. I don't think we were as good as working together. But one thing that I thought was better a little bit back then, I feel like I had better zingers. Like I spent some more time talking about Paul Mitchell, kind of the Paul Mitchell Miata. Like I had some good stuff, and honestly, I've been slacking on that. So we need to go back to the basics. So be prepared.
Yeah.
No,
I would, man. You would talk about some of those zingers for days leading up to the recording. You have been slacking.
When I would prep, man, I would. And honestly, the longer I think about it, the more little goodies that pop in. But, just like we've been talking about, sometimes, we get so into doing new things and wanting to learn better ways to hone our craft. But oftentimes we really need to go back to the basics.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. You ready to get started?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into this, right?
Go ahead.
Well,
I was going to explain what we're going to do.
Yeah. So was I. But
I think the last time we did is we kind of more summarized the book.
Yeah.
And hear what you should just read the book yourself, right? Which we think is important. So kind of what we're going to do is today we're going to kind of summarize this section with not too much detail. We'll just give you a high level of what it's about. And then Cameron and I are each going to come in with our kind of takeaways or some of the things that we had learned from that session. So again, listeners, this is not a competition to say whose highlights are better than the other guys. We are a team here. But I would encourage you to read the book, no matter where you are in your infinite banking journey. It's always great, again, to go back to the basics. And as I was preparing for this, I know as I've read this at least 5 times more than you, some new things still popped in. How about you?
Wait, as in like 5 more times?
Yeah,
like 1, 2,
5
3,
more.
4,
It
5
was
or
like
5
1.
times, like a multiple of 5.
Not, dude, 5 times more than you would be ridiculous. Okay. But 5 more, people would be like, yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, that is ridiculous.
Well, when you were going through this, did anything else pop up?
Yeah. That's what, it's one of my first takeaways, what I was going to share here.
Okay. All right, good. I'm glad I'm taking away your takeaways.
Yeah. Well, I see that, right. You got the first outline is becoming your own banker and when it got started, but I'm going to take it back. I'm going to take it to the introduction.
Oh, nice.
Introduction. Okay. You missed a few pages, did you? In your preparation?
The introduction, all of that stuff, unless it has a page number, I kind of skip.
Well, it does have a page number. So you got a page 3 right there. So it starts on page 3. But the takeaway, as you guys read this, the introduction to the 5th edition is really where Nelson is introducing kind of his approach and kind of the book and some of the ideas. And man, again, when I reread this, my biggest takeaway is I had this very emotional reaction to it, right? Is I'm hearing kind of Nelson in his own voice speaking, and I started highlighting some of these things.
Mhm.
Some of the things that he writes in here is he kind of comes off as an angry tone, I guess is what I was going to say. As I'm reading some of these, he says it's not about protection, it's not for financial advisors, it's not about investments of any kind, it's
Mhm.
not a get rich quick scheme, and I'm not talking about traditional banks. That has the 4 or 5 things that he outlines here, and then he finishes, right, on page 4, right? 4 comes after 3. But I love this part here. This is what I want to highlight. He says, "The concept's not complicated, it's just different." And I loved that
Mhm.
takeaway. And I think what he's trying to do in this little introduction, he's trying to get out ahead of everybody that says, "Hey, I know exactly what this is. I know what the product is. I've seen this strategy
Mhm.
before." He's trying to get out ahead of it and say, "No, this is something completely different." And I think he does a really good job in doing that. And the reason that I think he does that is because I think that people oftentimes get into a pattern of not even kind of questioning the process or the questioning why they're doing the things that they're doing. And so I really appreciated that in his introduction.
Well, I appreciate you bringing this up. That there was some good stuff in there. Could you mind repeating what he said that this is not?
Mm-hmm. He says this is first thing they says. He says this is not about your need for protection. He says this is not for financial advisors. It's written for the layman. He says this book is not about investments of any kind, and he says it's not a procedure to get rich quickly. He also says, I'm not talking about a bank in the conventional sense. And he finishes up with the concept is not complicated. It's just different from the way the majority thinks and behaves.
What I think is that's on the first page. Well, and how many people say things that contradict exactly what he said in the introduction? I
Mm-hmm.
find that very interesting.
Yeah. Well,
I also find it
I
interesting that you added some good content or something new to this. So that was
yeah.
double interesting.
It's interesting that you actually skipped a page or
That
two,
is.
or two, or two. Okay. So now let's go ahead and pick it up. Anthony, do you want
Well
to
done, Cameron.
introduce the next section to of this that we read?
Where he starts the book, and the section is called "Becoming Your Own Banker," and I love this this quote. And I don't know if it was really a quote, but just maybe a theory or somebody. But basically, it says if some authoritative power distributed all the money in the world equally to everyone around the world, within 10 years, 97% of the money would be under the control of 3% of the people. I mean, if you let that sink in, I think that is it's very true,
Very
right? It's
profound. Yeah.
very disturbing.
Yeah.
Nelson also talks about how there's one pool of money, and he is similar to one pool of water, and he talks about how we take water in through our body and then we excrete it out, and then it gets evaporated back in, uh, and it comes back in as rain. But it's like eventually, water flows through you, but will always end up in the ocean. And he assimilates that to dollars, right? Like there's one pool of money of the banking system, right? Whether it's all these banks, when you combine them, dollars all flow through there. And what he talks about, dollars flow through you, but they always end up in the banking system.
Hmm.
So, what were some of your key points in this
Uh,
section, Cam?
yeah, for me, I didn't have much else to add there, right? I highlighted 3 things. Banking is the most important business in the world. Number one, there's only one pool of money in the world. The third piece that I highlighted here is the last paragraph. It says it's all a matter of how much of the banking function you control as it relates to your needs. Oftentimes, when people ask about, how did you get started in this? What do you like about banking or infinite banking? My first response has always been control, right? And I think this
Mm-hmm.
is what the book highlights here first and foremost is, hey, listen, people are outsourcing the banking function of their life, and he's introducing us in a way to recapture that control. So I'm a huge fan of that piece.
Well, what really stood out to me is that, again, when we look at that one quote that Nelson started the book at, it talks about it's more important to knowing why it's more important than having money is to know how to make money. Because if you know how to make it, if you lose it, like in this example, you will have the ability to make more of it. And he also talks about like this is a process, not a product, right? With infinite banking, it's not just whole life. I mean, it's so much more than a single product. And I like how he talks about money like water needs to move, right? If water doesn't move, it becomes stagnant, right? It's unhealthy, it's stinky, it's not doing the job that it was made to do. Similar to money, if money were to stop flowing, people couldn't conduct business. We
Mm-hmm.
couldn't buy products. We couldn't buy hair products,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if money's not moving, money also is not doing its job. So it's important that money is flowing. And if we need, and also the importance of knowing how money works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, the next section he talks about how IBC got started, where Nelson talks about his background as a forester, how he was investing in real estate, following the gurus of using OPM, other people's money. But then back then, the prime rate was at 8%, shot up to 21.5. So his borrowing costs had tripled, and the gurus at the time would just tell him to sell it. But then that's the worst time to sell it in a down market. But with also he had a lot of tragedies going on right then. His house was broken into, his brother died, his granddaughter was diagnosed with cancer, right? And can you imagine? That's like the low, like just feeling just punched in the gut. But then it hit him, right? He had access to the funds and he didn't even know it. He could borrow the money from policy is already set up from 8 to 5%, which allowed him to be able to manage during that difficult time and be able to sell those assets at the top value as opposed to something being on sale. What were some of your takeaways, Cam?
Yeah. Uh, Great, man. Some of the highlights that you highlighted there. One was kind of the emotional takeaway that I had. Man, this part of the book, I got a very sense of desperation. Right, man, this guy is going through it. Right, he's got terrible advice from the traditional gurus that are out there. But also, man, just the family tragedies that you outlined. His brother passed away from a heart attack. His granddaughter was just diagnosed with cancer. The emotional toll that this man must have been going through, I couldn't imagine. Right in there, he says that he spent months praying. Right, and just this whole idea of desperation. There's two things that I highlighted there. One of them was this last paragraph on page 13, on the left half of the page. But he says the only thing that limits how much you can get to in this same thing will tell you at the sorry. The only thing that limits how much you can get to is the same thing they tell you at the bank when you ask them how big of a check you can write, is how much you've put in. Anthony, you made a comment just a second ago, and you said that he realized that he had access to funds that he had put away earlier. I think the key to this for me was, again, I've said this before, but again, here he is in this desperate situation. He's looking out there for someone to come and save him. He's looking for a savior, and then he realizes that he already did it himself. He did it for himself. Nobody was out there that was going to go do it for him. And I think for me, that was a very poignant point. Man, listen, nobody's going to do it for you. You're the one that's got to go out there and do it. And finally, he went and he searched months of praying. He was looking for, exterior options, circumstances outside of his control. And then he realizes, you know what? By the grace of God, I already had this set up for myself. And so that was a big takeaway for me. The second one was another poignant question. Poignant, Anthony. That means deeply disturbing,
Okay.
right? Or emotional. Yeah. He says, maybe you found yourself in such a financial prison, or maybe you want to develop a system that will keep you out. And I think that when we speak to a lot of people that call in, it's absolutely one of those two scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have typically gone down the traditional path. They found themselves in that situation. They've gotten terrible advice, right? Some of the circumstances are out of their control that aren't necessarily in their benefit, and they're looking to get out of kind of that traditional rut that they've been in. And then, man, I'll tell you what, I've said this before, but I'm really impressed with some of the younger individuals that have been calling in, wanting to work with us and are excited about infinite banking because they see kind of what's happened to their parents and they don't want to end up in the same situation. And so for me, that was a takeaway where, man, I think those two questions could make up the entirety of our clientele right there.
Well said,
Yeah,
Cameron. Thanks for sharing.
yeah.
A couple things that stood out for me is you can kind of see the makings. Like Nelson was in the right situation to really to discover infinite banking. His he started as a forester. Talk about thinking long term, right? They're thinking 40 years. 40 years is considered short term for them. And he sold life insurance. So I think those two things help set the stage for what he was able to build. One quote in there I liked. He said, "Banks are not lending you banks are lending you money not because you have real estate. Banks are lending you money because they think you can make the payments." Right? It just kind of hit home that it's all they care about. It. Can you pay back what you got?
Yeah.
Right. And it's just what is the collateral. Now we've talked a little bit about using OPM or other people's money.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, typically we are a fan, if we're going to buy real estate, that we can get a 30-year fixed. Right. But what we're doing there was we're having a long-term asset like real estate with a long-term loan. Right. Where we get into trouble is when we do short-term loans with a long-term asset. And so here his asset he still had, but the loans on the terms of the loan were changing. So again, we're not saying if we're going to use other people's money, I think that with the right education and resources, that'd be a smart thing to do. But this shows that we need to have some money in reserves, and ideally, if it's a long-term asset, we want a long-term loan backing it up. And another thing that hit me is it seems like when we're in the worst situations is when we find the best solutions. So imagine Nelson had just had his house burglarized. Have you ever had your house burglarized?
Mm-mm.
I've had a couple times, but I was kind of too young to really realize it.
Mm.
But I could imagine how violated that would feel. Like some stranger, some criminal is in your house. His brother died. His daughter is just diagnosed with cancer. Okay, I couldn't imagine dealing with, I mean, all of those, but then also now he had some financial difficulties where these interest rates rose. And it was in that situation is when he had to get creative. And that's when he had realized what he had had. So sometimes we're in those terrible situations. That's when we find great ways to get out.
Anthony, great points. And man, as you're talking, we kind of danced around this, but man, if you look at kind of what's been happening just in the last couple of years, I think it's very similar, right? History repeats itself. If you look at where he was, when he wrote this book, one, he was getting terrible advice from the gurus, but also Prime was at 8%, right? Prime's been at 8.5 now for the last several months. But man, if you go back, 18 months, 24 months, interest rates were still the lowest that they'd ever been, right? So you have this period of very low interest rates with this rapid succession. And here we are reading Nelson's book from 20 something years ago, where again, history repeats itself. So I think a lot of people, if they dug into kind of this section, would feel some similarities in what Nelson was going through.
I did. Part of me is upset that you shared that point, because I had that point and I somehow didn't make it to the notes, but I'm actually glad you did, because that's a good, often I think we got spoiled for the longest time that interest rates were so low, and we don't realize that there was a time interest rates were even higher.
Yeah.
I mean, we're complaining about the prime being 8.5. It was 21.
Yeah.
21%.
Yeah.
So I think the point is that interest rates go up and down and we're going to be okay.
Do you remember? I still remember having conversations, introducing banking to people, and they'd be like, "Well, what's my loan rate?" I'm like, "Well, it's 5." Like, why the hell would I ever pay 5% for a loan? You guys are crazy. You're like, well, it's not always going to be that way.
Yeah.
You guys are idiots. All right. Sorry. Anthony's an idiot. Moving on. moving on.
Oh, now, so the next section we're going to be talking about imagination,
Mm-hmm.
and what Nelson opens it up with a quote from Albert Einstein: "Imagination is more important than knowledge." And he talks about the infinite banking concept is an exercise in imagination, reason, logic, and prophecy. And he had shared a story of, I don't know how long ago this was, but
Carl Gauss,
yeah,
1700s.
okay, yeah, in the 1700s, perfect. Where where the story goes is that the professor was, I don't know, having a bad day and wanted to give the students some busy work, so he told them to add up all the numbers between 1 and 100. And I know for me, I would be like 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 3 is 6. I know you would be holding up your fingers, 1 plus 1 is 2, right? But what this guy did, he envisioned all the numbers from 1 to 100. And uh and then what he did, he somehow had the 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 thought to just add them up. If he just cut them in half, so he had uh 1 through 50, and then 100 through 49, and he realized if he added 1 plus 100, it's 101. Then he lined up 2 plus 99 is 101. 3 plus 98 is 101. So he realized this was just sections of 101. So he could just times 101 times 50. And the key thing is that he, Goss didn't, I'm probably saying his name wrong, but I do that all the time. But he didn't create this new theory of way to add up numbers. He just discovered the fact that was already there, but he had to do that by following his imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Takeaways, Cam.
Man, I really appreciate this section, and it's short, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
5 paragraphs
Mm-hmm.
long, page and less than a full page. Um, I agree. One of the things that I underlined was these gods could not conceive that they were dealing with a fixed relationship that they could not change and had no authority over, right? So again, that's the idea of we're just discovering these ideas that are out there. Um, but for me, man, imagination. One of the reasons I appreciate this so much is I think that a lot of times, I alluded to this in the introduction, was that a lot of times I think people go throughout the day and go throughout life without even thinking about what they're doing, right? There's a monotony to life that you can get caught up in, and people stop questioning certain things and they just start going through, day to day, right, without questioning anything. And one of the important things with imagination is it helps you to stop doing that. For me, I started when I read this one most recently, I started thinking of things that help me get out of kind of my day to day routines, things that kind of pull me out of it. And one of the ideas that I reflected on was actually road trips. So I don't know if I've shared much on the podcast, but on long weekends, we always take off. Hardly ever in
Mm-hmm.
town. We try to get out of town as quickly as often as we can. And one of the reasons that I enjoy road trips is because I can zone out, right? One of the shortest road trips for us is usually probably 4 hours. Some of the longer ones are maybe 9 or 10 hours. But man, one of the things I appreciate is just being able to zone out and sit there and think
Mm-hmm.
and really not have any distractions whatsoever, right? Our kids are at the age where they're typically on iPads at this point. And so just having the ability to stop and to think a little bit is something that I think a lot of us are missing. And so, again, that would be the takeaway that I'd have for this section is find something, whether it's road trips or maybe read a Bible or something where you can stop and kind of check out of your day.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would help a lot of people.
Good stuff, Cam.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would tell you what was interesting going through this again. Like I had said, I picked up some new things, and I would say, to be honest, as many times as I've read this, I never really thought the whole process down of what Goss did
Mm-hmm.
until this time. I wanted to have a visual, and then you could really see it. So, also, Goss was 7 years old.
Oh, I didn't catch
I didn't
that.
catch that either. 7 years old. I don't know.
Oh,
They're
wow.
not teaching that
Hmm.
in the 21st century to 7 year olds, but that I thought was very interesting. But this also talks about there are these natural laws that no politicians in government can overcome, maybe temporarily, but eventually the the natural law will come out. Nobody can. And also, Gauss didn't create this theory, it was already there. He just discovered it. Same thing with Nelson Nash. He didn't create infinite banking, it was already there.
Hmm.
Right, these products were already there. The banking process is really a natural law. He was the one who had discovered it.
I just read my notes over here. It says Carl Gauss came to the same conclusion as everyone else. He just used a more efficient method.
Mm.
And this, I think, will come a little bit later when we get into page 44, 45, where Nelson starts comparing different accounts that you can use for
Hmm.
banking. You don't need a whole life policy to do banking, right? It's just the most efficient account that you can use that's out there,
Hmm.
right? So just a little tie in for you. You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. This next section is probably one that's a more popular section. I think we typically might discuss this when we're going through the education process with our clients, and it's called the grocery store,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so he talks about owning a grocery store, all it takes to set it up, and the key thing is what he had pointed out. Let's say that we have a can of peas that we sell for 60 cents, but it cost us 57, right? That's 3 cents in profit. But what that means, we need to sell that or turn it over 19 times to be able to get back the 57 cents that we had put into it. And and the big question he has in here is, where are you going to shop for peas?
Mm-hmm.
The grocery store that you own or a grocery store that somebody else owns? And most people are going to pick their own store. But the key thing is, do they go through the front door or the back door? Right. And a lot of people are tempted to go out the back door, in part um, because they don't want to have to pay for it. Right. It's their store. Why do they need to pay for it? And also, if they do, it's now they're going to have a bigger net income and they're going to pay more in taxes. But what he put in there is, like with infinite banking, it takes away both of those, because that money just goes in one account that you own and control, in your policy that you own and control. And this is outside the tax system. So so your policy is growing tax free. So there is no tax uh, penalty for not for stealing the peas, is what Nelson talks about. Because Cameron, I don't know if you put this together, but the grocery store is your policy, right? And the can of peas that you're taking off the shelf, those are your dollars, right? And so it's not like, so when you
Ah.
borrow a dollar or take a dollar from your grocery
Hmm.
store, your policy, you need to pay it back. So I probably blew your mind there. I don't know if you need a minute to digest, but any takeaways from that section?
Wow. Takeaway is just how just intelligent you are. That's just amazing. I'm
Mm,
impressed.
mm,
Uh Takeaway, the when I read this section, there's a couple ideas that jump out at me. One is the idea of this grocery store. I think that Nelson is using a grocery store again is because this is a business that everybody is both a consumer and a seller of kind of the
mhm,
same thing.
mhm,
But he goes in to outline kind of what it takes to get a grocery store up and going. And I think this is why business owners identify with infinite banking so much, is because, man, it is a process. It is not something that happens overnight. It's not easy by any means. The 5 steps that he outlines is one is you got to start by studying, right? What is this business all about? Is there an opportunity there?
mhm.
Number two is you need to go out there and you need to go find a location. Three is you have to actually build a building. You need a place. Four is you have to stock it with merchandise. And then five is you got to go out there and you got to hire employees, right? You can't do this thing by yourself. So that kind of lays the foundation for thinking long term in regards to a policy and building those cash values. Also, the other piece to this is he introduces us to this idea of compound interest versus velocity.
Mm.
Two really big points that I think oftentimes get overlooked. Most of the time, people are so focused on compound interest that they don't technically understand velocity. Compound interest, as opposed to velocity, is where you take a product and you let it sit, right? If you were to buy a baseball card 30 years ago and you stick it on the shelf and then you're hoping and praying that this thing's going to appreciate in value, right? That's compound interest where you let the product sit, you don't do anything and just appreciates in value over time. Whereas velocity is taking a product, adding a little surcharge, and then turning that product as many times in 1 year as you possibly can. And so when you look at his example, right, the peas, right, is that product that he's going to be turning as many times in 1 year as you possibly can. Or to extend Anthony's example, is these are the dollars that we need to turn every single year as many times as we can. And so again, the what happens oftentimes is I think that most individuals, just regular lay people, are told by traditional financial advisors that the best option that's about out there for them to make money and to invest is that compounding idea. Take your money, put it in here, and you let it sit there for however many years. And they've never taught anything about how to turn a product or create velocity with their dollars. But business owners intuitively understand this is because that's what they're doing every single day, right? They're out there, they're churning their product, whether it's a gas station and they're selling a water bottle for 90 cents, for $1, buy it for 90, add 10 cents, and they sell it for $1, right? The more times they can turn that, the more money they make. Or if it's a dentist where somebody comes in and they sit in their chair, right? If you see one patient a day, you're not making any money, right? If you have 20 people sitting in that chair throughout the course of a day, now you're making money. And so it's the same idea of just turning a product. So, 2, 3 big ideas there that were kind of my takeaway when I read this section. Really sets the foundation for kind of introducing us to banking moving forward.
Well done, Cameron.
Well, thanks.
One quote he had in there, he said, "The objective of the business is to provide you with income and to build a business that you eventually sell to someone else to provide you with retirement income." So one of the things I think he was talking about, the reason why you want to pay yourself back so the business looks better and it's more true, so you can sell it eventually and create retirement income. But I figured, isn't that really what we're doing with our policies? Right? We're setting up these policies. Particularly what teaching our clients to do is use a policy to buy assets, ideally cash flowing assets, to produce that income. And then eventually we're producing these income and we can turn our policy into tax-free cash flow in retirement. Um, again, that's another reason why we need to repay our loans and don't steal the peas, because he had talked about how many times you need, if you steal that can of peas, you have to sell 19, I believe was the number, just to break even. Now, but imagine if you steal that can of peas, right? You got to turn it over 19 times more just to recoup what was stolen. And if we think about that, and when we're still in the peas, meaning we're borrowing money from our policy and not putting it back, that we're still in the peas from our future, and how important it is that when we borrow money, that we do provide a way to pay it back. And then he also talks, I know one reason why a lot of people may do stuff under the table, so they don't want to have to pay taxes. But you know what, it makes infinite banking even more unique is not only does that still in the peas not affect, or you pay in the peas doesn't affect your tax bill. In fact, if you use it to buy assets, we're actually creating some tax deductions out of this. So it's even more reason or more advantages that when you take money out, take from your policy, that we need to pay it back plus interest.
Well said. Well said. I'm looking at my notes here. I got a couple extra. One of them in the bottom left. I was surprised at just how prevalent or how perverse not reverse, prevalent the theft was, right? It was a huge margin. I don't know where I got this number, but in my notes it says 85% of theft was done by employees. Right? That's crazy. I went and I looked a couple things up, but what it said is that the total revenue for the retail industry in 2023 is 4.9 trillion. And from Capital One Shopping Research, an article written April of 2024 says that stores lost 121 billion to employee-related theft. Yeah, that's wild.
And that's just employee. I think there's a lot more. These people that are storming these stores are not employees.
Yeah.
So that's in addition.
Yeah. But in this scenario, what he's referring to is the individual stealing, right, money from themselves, right? When people ask us what's one of the downsides to this, or what's the way to ruin this thing, one is to never pay yourself back, right? You're stealing the peas, and again, that falls on you. That falls on the individual for not making those payments and replenishing those dollars. So, again, whether this thing fails or is a huge success is dependent upon how you handle it.
Well said, Cam.
Thanks.
I like how you came in, you shared some, and then you kind of shared some more.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah.
There was some good stuff.
Thanks.
You know what I think is also interesting on here. This is some value of collaborating and working with other people. With a lot of the highlights we pointed out, different areas spoke to us. So I think it allows us to provide even more to our listeners.
Yeah, well said. All right, Anthony, let's wrap this thing up, right? We just went through the first 16 pages of Nelson's book. We're revisiting this. We're getting back to the basics. Guys, if you're out there and you're listening and you're thinking, man, I've got some questions or this is of interest to you, make sure you schedule a discovery call with us. Feel free to reach out. You'll end up on a call with myself, Anthony, or one of our coaches, and we'll kind of give you an idea. We'll ask you some questions, and at the end of the day, we're going to give you our honest feedback on whether we think infinite banking is a good fit for you or not. So hopefully you guys will find some interest and join us on our IBC journey.
So what we encourage you to do is to get the book and then read it along with us. We're putting the show notes where you a link to get the book on Amazon. And the next section we're going to do is we're going to talk about the problem, about how much interest we are paying to others. And then a key function that Nelson talks about, and I think we need to maybe shed more light on it, is that you finance everything you buy, right? You either use cash and give up interest, break the compound interest curve, or you borrow money and pay interest. So Nelson always says you either give up or pay up. However, with the infinite banking, it's like a sweet spot in the middle where we have the ability to maximize both. And one quote he talks about in the next section is, if you know what's happening, then you know what to do. Go make it a fantastic day.
Take care.
If you like this video, I know you'll like this one. And if you want to learn how investors use infinite banking to increase their returns and lower their taxes, check this out. And if you have some questions and want to see if infinite banking is for you, hop on a discovery call with us. Link for that will be in the description.